So for the Big Ideas Week, we really did, John kind of poked fun a little bit at the keynote idea. And I think he's right about that, because there's something a bit lofty about it all that, in a sense, we want to almost kind of break that down a little bit and create a kind of theory camp feel for you. But I do think there's something important about hearing from someone at the front of the room speak about one aspect of the course each of the days. So for example, I'll be speaking about history in an intense and kind of detailed way to take responsibility for the curriculum that you're going to be hearing about in the form of a lecture. And I hope that you'll appreciate the form. I know it's an old form, but I do think there's something to be said about it. I'll be speaking up here for about 40 minutes, but I do want you to pay attention in ways that acknowledge and can anticipate my questions to the group about what you've heard, what you think about, questions you may still have, and so on. So the title of my lecture is History Matters, an introduction and a provocation. The introduction part is meant to reference people in the room who do not have a background in history, who are uncertain about the history of Canada and Ontario in particular. You certainly do not need to be an expert to listen to me talk about this particular time and place in history. So it's an introduction, but I add a provocation to those of you in the room who I kind of surveyed yesterday, who are in history and who are going to need to hear me gloss over some things, because I know that any good historian can recognize the bits that are left behind when someone is doing an introductory piece. So hear this as a provocation for those of you who are aware of this history. But I do start with 3 questions. And these 3 questions are going to organize how I address history today. So the first question is, how can history help us think about why children have to go to school? The second question is, what is the relationship between compulsory education, so the why children have to go to school by law, and the violence of colonization? Number 3 is, what does it mean to inherit education's colonial legacies as a teacher entering the profession today? So those are the 3 questions that we'll move through. So education precedes the advent of compulsory education. Over 200 years ago, and arguably still today, children learned from their parents, elders, and community leaders the skills they needed to survive and thrive within a given context. Learning, we could say, with Mario, was thoroughly place-based. Children learned at home, from the land, through apprenticeship. Education was not yet organized by state-sanctioned rules and regulations that made it a universal experience. Schooling, as we know of it today, and as many of you came through it, did not exist. The invention of the school, as organized by the state, emerged alongside at least 3 other related forces at work during the 19th century. These forces were industrialization, colonization, and the making of the nation. Amid these forces, schooling promised to produce disciplined workers to support the factory labor of the Industrial Revolution. As Paul Axelrod writes, in the clamorous world of industrial capitalism, educators were expected to prepare not only a literate student, but a disciplined, employable, and productive workforce. We might even recognize this aim in education today. Still, the majority of teachers in the early 1800s, now get this, were often those deemed unsuitable for other kinds of hard labor. In most cases, teachers had little or no training. Mostly, the qualification was the ability to read and to write. So consider the case of Eleonora Helen, who was born 1823 and died in 1846. Eleonora, in 1836, became a teacher at the age of 13 because of her ability to read and write. Eleonora emigrated with her family from England to Upper Canada, now known as Ontario. From her diary entries, which are housed in the Ontario archives, you might guess that I spend some time there, we know that she had been homeschooled by a governess, and upon her arrival to Upper Canada, she began to teach local children alongside another woman named Miss Pettis, who taught in the log cabin of her home. Eleonora died at the age of 23, probably just a few years older than many of you in the room today, but that's my guess. She most likely died from tuberculosis, a highly contagious and fatal disease that teachers, from what I understand still today, must prove they do not have before they can enter into a school. Is it true that you had to do your tuberculosis test? I'm seeing one nod. Yes? Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's still there. Okay. Now, but during this very same period, the image of the child was beginning to change radically. So where children had been seen as quite capable workers, whether in the field or the factory, or in the case of Eleonora, the one-room school, they were increasingly pictured in the mid-1800s as innocent and in need of protection from work. This image of the innocent child gained momentum from the child-saving movement that emerged at the turn of the century, and which involved the political efforts of adults to liberate children from their posts at the factory. The photography of Louis Hine offers us an evidence base of the kinds of images that were circulating in the mid to late 1800s. His photographs represent children as vulnerable and in need of protection from the harsh realities of labor factory work. So we can see 3 photographs that he would take. Now, if Louis Hine, who had taken the photographs, was using these as part of a child-saving movement to rescue the child from the harsh realities of labor factory work, which had been their experience, what qualities of these children do you notice his images attempting to lift up and capture? How would you describe the children in these images? Sad? Sad? Anyone? Yes?
I noticed that most of the children didn't even look like white people.
Yeah. Yeah, there's definitely, who is working in the factory is a lower class and racialized child quite often. Absolutely. Yep.
Dirty, and also they all have on the same uniform to eliminate their identity.
Yeah. Dirty, in need of rescue from that, you know, some cleaning up perhaps. Yeah.
Tired.
That comment was tired. Yeah.
Just look like many adults.
Yes. Yeah. So they still acquire the history that Hine was attempting to disrupt. So it's true, especially the Bleecker boys, I find they look like little men going off to work. And I think that's the very image that Hine was attempting to say, do we really want to be doing this? And so they carry an innocent quality too as a way to suggest we may now need to have a category called childhood that we protect. And soon enough you'll know that education becomes implicated in that story, that we protect in a place called education. Last comment. Yeah?
Also, I see a fair bit of strength in how they're presenting themselves, because not a single one of them is burying their head in their hands crying, saying, get me out of here. They're all, we got this, in some respects.
Yeah. I mean, it's nice because when you're taking photographs, I find the ones that I enjoy, and probably this is why I chose these do have a sense of dignity about them. I would agree with you about that. Yeah. Okay. And speaking to the point about race over here. So while Hine is creating these images to construct an image of the child as innocent and in need of rescue from hard labor, the child-saving movement also worked on a racial paradox. So if some children were represented as needing protection from the ills of society or the ills of the factory, poor and racialized children were constructed as the other to the white blanket of innocence. It was society that required protection from the latter group. But whether innocent or a threat, a perceived threat to society, the school was put forward as an antidote to the unfinished state of childhood. Alison Prentice, whose work you will read in the history module of this course, shows how schools were viewed as engines of perfectibility that moved children from an innocent state of unknowing to the Enlightenment ideal of reason and mastery. Many historians suggest that the construction of the child as innocent and infinitely perfectible was actually a placeholder or a symptom for the adults' anxieties of living in a society that was rapidly changing from agriculture to industry. In this context of uncertainty, the child became something to track and measure through education. Where there was the adult fear of change, there emerged the promise of the school to ensure self-control, social order, and discipline. I show you 3 images of schoolhouses here. A one-room schoolhouse in 1898 in Ottawa, Ontario. I think one image of the very promise of order begins, and I think remains, in the school photograph genre, where you can line everyone up in neat rows according to height, and everything's just there, just so in order. So this is an early image of the school photograph. It represents a kind of order. And then, of course, the rows that also do. And here we are in a very similar context where we have the myth or fantasy of order in a room of great imagination and diversity. I hope many of you are defying the order of the rows that you're sitting in by doodling, thinking, so on. Of course, there is nothing inherently wrong with the aim of helping children become reasonable people. The problem comes when we take this aim to be a neutral idea, which is, for historians, impossible, insofar as such theories are shaped by the cultural values and social contexts of their invention. For instance, implied in the aim and even idealization of reason as an aim of schooling, there is a simultaneous valuation of this form of knowledge over and above what would be perceived as non-rational forms of knowing, for instance, in such things as intuition, care, or empathy. But as well, the aim of enlightenment became the justification for the brutal treatment of any child who is deemed unable to achieve this state, known as a virtue. The key idea to hold on to here is that there is nothing neutral about claims to help children think better or more rationally, because it depends upon a binary that constructs as inferior and at worst inhuman qualities that are deemed unreasonable and by virtue uncivilized, a point to which I shall return in a moment. But first, let's meet one of the strongest patriarchs and proponents of the aim of enlightenment through schooling. Egerton Ryerson was a Methodist minister who was appointed in 1844 by the British Crown to serve in the role of Superintendent of Education for what was then the province of Canada. Ryerson has been known to say great things about education and about the education he imagined in particular. One of those things is this: on the importance of education, we may remark, it is as necessary as the light, it should be as common as water, and as free as air. This is a seemingly difficult point to dispute. But again, as we'll see, there is nothing neutral, easy, or innocent about it. Under Ryerson's leadership, the government of Upper Canada passed a piece of legislation in 1846 entitled the Common Schools Act. This document brought Ryerson's vision of education to life. It led to the creation of a General Board of Education. The president of the board was John Strawn, who was a convert to Anglicanism and, like Ryerson, also a man of strong religious affiliation. The Common Schools Act was used to expand and regulate the reaches of education to masses of children, to establish the governance of school boards across the province, and to approve curriculum materials that were thought to be suitable for use in schools. The particularities of education at home or on the field or in the workshop were now changed by the universalizing force of common schooling intended for all children. Most important among curricular materials were books, songs, and history lessons that could create and bolster this sense of cohesion among young people who attended the school. And this was to support settlement of the nation. Now, the Common Schools Act was also used to establish formal teacher education, known then as normal schools, which regulated the training of teachers. You might want to recognize yourselves here in Ryerson's vision. He might be the reason, one of the reasons that you're all here. In 1847, every normal school, which are now faculties of education, used entrance requirements to determine who could train to teach. Do you have any ideas of what some of those standards might be? Can I take 3 guesses of what you think they could look like? Yeah.
Being able to read and write.
Yep, you were listening. Awesome. Being able to read and write. Yeah. In the back?
I'm not sure, maybe you have to have a religious affiliation with the church.
Very, very close. You have to have a religious affiliation with the church. Yeah. And anything else? These are great guesses. Yeah.
Probably white.
Probably white. Speaking of the hidden curriculum, I think that might be a hidden curriculum requirement. But that's going to get us to segregated schools, actually. So your observation's actually complicated, and it's going to get to the question of what to do with racial diversity in education. So I would say, yeah, I would say implicitly or explicitly, if you're going to teach in a religious affiliated school, I would say race and I'd say whiteness would be a requirement. Yeah.
Conform to cultural values?
Pardon me?
It conform to normal cultural values?
Yeah. So you have a normative cultural existence. Yeah. Especially for women, I would suggest. I mean, there's a whole bunch of standards of practice which I didn't put up here, but you wouldn't be able to attend the pool hall and so on. And our issues these days are Twitter, right? So how do you keep your professional identity? So in any case, you've got them all. So standards of admission required some evidence of previous education and proof of moral character. That's generally. In 1847 in this province, the specific requirements were that 1, the applicant had to be over the age of 16, 2, to be competent in reading and writing and simple math, and 3, provide letter from clergy testifying to moral character, so affiliation with the church, which has undertones and underwritten ideas about what race that means and so on. In some ways, these are amusingly easy compared to what all of you had to demonstrate for admission at York. At the same time, and uncannily, they presume to measure the same dimensions that I think York is looking for in all of you: maturity, previous education, and morality. There are these things that still exist as undertones to the very institution that you are in right now. As schools began to expand, the image of the teacher also began to change. No longer dominantly male, teaching became increasingly feminized. This was in part due to the economics of industry. As men became increasingly required for work in the factories, women took up positions in the school. Their labor was comparatively more economical. In 1870, the average salary for male teachers was $435 a year, compared to the $205 a year earned by their female counterparts. The history of the Teachers' Federation, headed by Hazel Roberts, sought to change this disparity, but that was not until well into the 1900s. Part of the reason for the difficulty is the way that gender stereotypes connected teaching to the feminine ideal of mothering and caring, a stereotype that education, in particular the primary junior division, I think inherits today. From the connection between teaching and mothering, there was born the pervasive cultural myth that defined the good teacher as, quote, natural or altruistic or maternal. But this pervasive myth stands in opposition to the idea that the teacher, particularly the woman teacher, should require or even demand a good wage. I still know teachers who feel guilty for getting paid, in any case. Despite evidence of such disparities in pay, Ryerson's standardization of schooling and teacher education consciously aimed to close gaps that he believed plagued early forms of education. On one level, then, Ryerson sought to equalize the right of the school by extending it to increasing numbers of children and workers. And yet it is difficult to disentangle Ryerson's vision from the will to power and domination. The passion to make schooling common for all also carried a passion to eradicate difference. So time marches on. In 1867, under the British North America Act, the province of Canada, made then from Upper and Lower Canada, was divided into the provinces we know of today as Ontario and Quebec. In Section 91(3) of the British North America Act, Ontario was legislated by constitutional law to safeguard the existing rights of two religious groups in its development of common schools. These groups were the Protestant majority and the Catholic minority. This provision was strategic, for at the time, no political leader of settler communities would agree to enter into confederation without some guarantee of the right to control religious education. Put another way, confederation represented a contract and a compromise. Send your children to common school to become citizens of the nation, and the nation will protect your religion as a constitutional right. From the vantage of this policy document, Ryerson's vision of the common school cannot be separated from his investment in Protestant Christianity. As the Catholic minority fought for a separate school system, the Christian values of Protestant Christianity became the quiet, invisible standard traveling under the seemingly neutral banner of the common school. And so from the beginning, the aims of the common school were themselves carried on metaphors of Protestant values that equated learning with industry, morality, and enlightenment that simultaneously cast as inferior their perceived opposites: disorder, chaos, darkness. So fast forwarding a bit to 1896, let's read an excerpt of a letter penned by a teacher about Ryerson to get a sense of the Protestant values circulating within his vision of the common school. So this teacher writes, "When our great and good Dr. Ryerson brought to the scene of the common school, when our great and good Dr. Ryerson assumed the Herculean task laid upon him by the government, it appears to one that before his appointment, the state of our schools was without form and void. Darkness covered the land, and gross darkness the minds of the people. And now, what do we behold? A system, for a system it most certainly is, that his genius conceived and brought forth from this chaotic mass, that the most civilized nation on earth might well be proud, and every patriotic Canadian may justly boast." So here, steeped in images of darkness and light, chaos and order, Mr. Foran's portrait of common schooling is also saturated in religious discourse, which had a devastating effect on families, children, and communities that its system set out to colonize and frankly destroy. And this was done ironically in the name of enlightenment and even freedom. So my next question of the lecture is, what is the relationship between compulsory schooling and colonization? So there's a shadow side to this Enlightenment story of the common school. This is a story of colonization that enacted its first project of power on newly immigrated Irish Catholics. Upon their arrival during the 1850s, many of whom were seriously ill with typhus and cholera, Ryerson suggested that their ailments were blameworthy signs of, and I quote, social insubordination and disorder. He further cautioned, and I'm quoting again, that this untaught and idle pauper immigration threatened to undermine the existing laws of Upper Canada. Ryerson, without surprise, offered schooling as the antidote. In his words, Only the diffusion of education among immigrants could counteract what was becoming an unfortunate influence on provincial affairs. This discourse of pauper immigration and the alleged need for its correction mirrors the language of chaos and order found in Mr. Foran's congratulatory letter of 1896. And yet, in order for the school to be regarded as an antidote, it first had to construct as inferior and frankly ill anyone who did not display the requisite qualities, values, and beliefs underlying French and British colonial institutions. Among these others included the Irish, as I mentioned already, but also Black loyalists and freedom seekers fleeing the battle for independence in America via the Underground Railroad. Also included among Ontario's early arrivals were Chinese, German, Italian, Japanese, Portuguese, Ukrainian, and Lithuanian immigrants, to name a few. In light of Ontario's diversity, it is important to note that the very policies Ryerson developed in the name of the common school were not equally extended to all children. Schooling was a mechanism of domination over those who were thought to be other to the boundaries of the nation. Remember the Common Schools Act of 1846 that I put up a few slides ago? Well, it matters that this act was passed at the height of the first freedom movement of the Americas, and that involved the migration of the largest number of Black freedom seekers through the Underground Railroad. While it is more often the history of rescue that Canadian textbooks like to tell, it is also the case that the Common School Act included an amendment in 1849 that suggests a less than hospitable welcome. The amendment permitted municipal schools to, and I'm quoting, authorize a school district to establish any number of schools for the education of the children of colored people that they may judge expedient. Now, it is complicated because this amendment was intended to rectify the exclusion of Black students from the common school. The justification for the amendment reads thusly: because the prejudices and ignorance of Ontario residents have prevented Black students from attending common schools in their district, we need an amendment for separate schools, is the idea. Now, sadly, segregation was at this time a solution to racism, even while it also sustained existing conditions of schooling that were themselves racist. Segregated schools were chronically underfunded, and despite having good teachers, there were massive systemic inequities in the form of the unequal allocation of resources, training, and maintenance of buildings to support conditions of learning. You will learn more about the complexities of segregated schools when we watch Sylvia Hamilton's really amazing and informative and heart-wrenching, actually, representation of this history in her film, The Little Black Schoolhouse, which we're going to watch when half of you break to go see your tutorials. We're going to be showing this on either side, so all of you will get a chance to see this today. And we'll learn much more about that. Another site in which to think about the exclusions and violence of colonization that history set into motion via the school is in the history of the residential school. By residential school, and many of you will have heard of this history is becoming public in ways that are unprecedented for the time that I've been teaching at York, and I feel that it's finally a time when I can look at the room and know that this history will have met your minds, or you must have encountered it in some way, shape, or form. So I'm going to give you an iteration of some of the history of some of the things you see in the news headlines and so forth, but I am aware that you're probably up to speed on the kinds of issues that are coming forward in the news around the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and so on. But another site to think about colonization and violence is in the context of the residential school. And by residential school, I'm not referring to a building or a set of schools, but I'm actually referring to an entire system and a mechanism of political colonization that was central to the government's project to eradicate the knowledge, language, and familial ties of Indigenous people in what is now Canada. In 1760, when the French dropped the reins of empire on the Plains of Abraham, the British picked up where they left off. Already in place was a policy of civilization, or Frenchification, as it was then called, which referred to the assimilation of Indigenous people into the culture, language, values, and beliefs of empire. As early as 1820, the governor of Upper Canada, Sir Peregrine Maitland, presented a proposal to the Colonial Office on the question of, quote, improving the conditions of Indians in the neighborhood of the colonial settlements. This proposal contained all of the techniques that would be adopted and applied over the next 3 decades. His proposal called for the conversion of hunters into settled agriculturalists under the supervision of the Indian Affairs Department and missionaries. Maitland's civilizing plan brought forward the idea of the residential school, one of them pictured here. The residential school, as Maitland imagined it, would provide instruction in reading, writing, and arithmetic, but more to the point, instruction in Christianity and Victorian virtues of order and control that would mimic the figure of the British colonial subject. From Maitland's report forward, officials in the Department of Indian Affairs took the position that adults could only make limited progress towards civilization. And by the end of the 1840s, they focused their efforts almost exclusively and with more aggression on children. In 1847, just 1 year after Ryerson published his Common Schools Act, the province of Canada published a report based on Ryerson's ideas, which formed the basis of a policy called Indian education. In this report, the colonizing aims of education are clear. And I'm quoting, Indian education must consist not merely of the training of the mind, but of a weaning of the habits and feelings of their ancestors and the acquirements of the language, arts, and customs of civilized life. Curriculum in this context did not simply refer to an academic schedule, but a concerted effort to destroy the language of Indigenous children and Indigenous cultures writ large. Often, children were not referred to by their name. They were assigned a number and addressed in that way. Educational success was measured by the degree to which the child had exchanged ties to culture for the Christian doctrines that tore generations apart. We can catch a glimpse of the government's aims in 2 images of a child named Thomas Moore, and that's the only name that we know of to refer to this child, whose story you're going to read about in the history module of this course. In brief, his photographs were taken and circulated in a pamphlet in 1904 by officials in the Department of Indian Affairs. But where the photograph was intended as a portrait of success and conquer, historian John Malloy asks us to read the photographs as evidence of cultural violence incurred in the name of education. However, in 1858, the Department of Indian Affairs reported a perceived problem. And it was a problem because it was a failure of their own fantasy of conquest. The report identified what were called cultural backsliders, a term meant to denote children who failed, and I quote, to carry back with them to their homes any desire to spread among their people the instruction which they had received. Now, today we might understand the child's failure to spread colonial knowledge to parents and elders as a reasonable response and even hopeful example of resistance against the colonizing force of the school. But from the vantage of the government and religious leaders of the time, cultural backsliders were read as examples of failed civilization that gave officials more reason to tighten education's hold. In 1883, Canada's Prime Minister, John A. Macdonald, addressed the House of Commons on the issue of backsliding. When the school is on the reserve, the child lives with its parents, who are savages. He is surrounded by savages. And though he may learn to read and write, his habits, his training, and his mode of thought are Indian. He is simply a savage who can read and write. It has been strongly pressed on myself, as the head of the department, that Indian children should be withdrawn as much as possible from parental influence, and the only way to do that would be to put them in central training industrial schools where they will acquire the habits and modes of thought of white men. Following MacDonald's brutal lead, the government shifted its policies once again, introducing what was called an aggressive assimilation policy that really upped the ante of existing tactics. One of these included a more aggressive education. One of these was the more aggressive tactic to separate children from parents and community for as long as possible. Through sustained separation, or what one Anglican bishop called continual residence, it was imagined that assimilation would be accomplished more speedily and thoroughly. But recalling the policy's official name, Bishop might have said more aggressively. To ensure sustained separation between parents and children, the department built schools in areas that were increasingly more remote and isolated from the reserves. Sometimes the schools were built on such remote land that it was impossible to carry out the agriculture curriculum that was meant to create farmers from hunters. Increasingly anxious parents and elders refused to enroll their children in the schools. But the Indian Act bestowed the right on truancy officers to forcibly remove children from non-compliant families. Parents who did send their children, as one survivor recalls, quote, could not fathom the violence that would unfold in the very school they were told was needed for survival in changing times. These are some images of the residential schools, and you can get a sense of their remoteness. Now, in 2008, Prime Minister Stephen Harper addressed this history. He apologized on behalf of all Canadians for the implication of the government in the destruction of Indigenous people through the residential system of education in Canada. The apology was broadcast on the CBC, or the Canadian Broadcasting Corporation. Can I get a show of hands of how many of you have watched this? Okay. If you haven't, I really encourage you to watch the video. It's on YouTube, I should say. On the one hand, Harper's apology was a long-awaited acknowledgement of the state-sanctioned abuse of Indigenous people. And yet, on the other hand, it has been heavily critiqued for the way it represents yet another celebratory image of the government as once again rescuing the Indigenous other, which is the very logic on which residential schooling itself was based in the first place. The lesser-known story is that before Harper's apology, First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people had already been politically active in the call to the government to redress its hand in cultural genocide. Harper's apology can be seen as one response to those efforts. But before Harper's apology, in 1996, the government announced an Indian Residential Schools Agreement, a court-approved agreement consisting of 5 key parts intended to redress the devastation of colonial history. One key part of the agreement was the establishment of the Indian Residential Schools Truth and Reconciliation Commission, launched on June 2nd, 2008. At first, conflict within the committee brought the commission to a halt, but it was relaunched with new membership in 2009. Members include Honorable Justice Murray Sinclair of the Ojibwe, Mary Wilson, whose career is dedicated as an educator and as a journalist working in cross-cultural environments. And third, Cree Chief Wilton Littlechild, I should say, one of the first Treaty First Nations people to receive his law degree from the University of Alberta in 1976. By August 2012, the federal government released over 941,000 documents pertaining to residential schools to the TRC for archiving, for analysis, and for assessment. In addition, the Commission traveled to many regions across the country to gather and document testimony of survivors of the residential schools. The aim was to initiate a much-needed dialogue about what survivors need to heal themselves, their families, their community, and the nation. Survivors articulate a number of needs, but one of the most prevalent that I've noticed in my reading of the document is the need for listening and the need for learning about the truth of the past that is not simply the rescue narrative told by the state and the church. To this end, thousands of survivors have risked stepping forward to testify to sexual, physical, emotional abuse experienced at the hands of the school staff and missionaries. Many call for changes to the education system and curriculum so that children learn about the history of the nation as connected to genocide. Others invite non-native settlers to join in solidarity protests across the nation, such as the Idle No More movement, which some of you may have participated in. Still others remind non-native settlers to try to avoid wallowing in empty feelings of guilt and self-focused sorrow. Their testimony speaks to the fact that despite the brutal intent of the government, its mission failed. First Nations, Métis, and Inuit people have survived and will continue to do so. Some of the findings of the TRC can be found on my next slide. It's a 400-page document. And in that document, the Commission reports that over 150,000 First Nations, Inuit, and Métis children were removed from their communities and forced to attend the schools. While in attendance, it is estimated that more than 4,000 children died on the watch of the Canadian government. Many ran away, got lost, and starved to death, and in winter months, they froze to death in search of home. Still more children who remained at the schools died of tuberculosis, contracted from the very settlers who claimed to rescue them from their own existence. Seven generations of children were subject to residential school education and its system of neglect and abuse. In the online portion of the history module, you will have the opportunity to read the Commission report with a focus on its calls to action, particularly as these pertain to education and childhood. This document has direct bearing on how teachers can take responsibility for education's hand in the cultural destruction of Indigenous families and people. Now, despite Harper's apology in 2008, he has not responded to the findings of the TRC. On May 6, 2015, the Conservatives actually voted down a bill that would align the government to one of the key calls of the TRC to action. This would be the call for the implementation of a United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People that would require the nation to formally adopt its frame and its procedures in making political decisions regarding resource allocation, land use, and education. In voting down this bill, many argue that Harper's government has failed to honor the apology. The last residential school was closed in 1996, and yet the legacy of these schools poses a question to teachers about what reconciliation can mean beyond the repetition of colonial fantasies of education to the rescue. And also, there remains a question about what it can mean to bear responsibility for experiences and events that are older than your own efforts. And it is this question that I'd like to put up as a conclusion to the lecture, in that what does it mean to inherit a history of schooling that is older than you, and that you nonetheless inherit by virtue of entering into this profession? Does anyone have any thoughts on that question? I have a little small concluding paragraph, but are there thoughts about what you think it can mean to take responsibility as you sit in the room for history that you did not personally choose or affect, or, yeah?
It means that respect needs to be at the forefront of your mind, basically. You must respect what's come before you. And also the culture of the people who you're teaching. Take that into account.
So it really highlights or illuminates this question of respect for you, respect for diversity of the students who enter into your classroom. Yeah. Yeah.
While you may not share the blame of what happened before, you need to take the responsibility to make amends.
Yeah. So in a way, whether or not one is directly implicated isn't the question. The question of reconciliation does involve taking a stand against something that you aren't personally responsible for, but that might be part of what that work is about, is holding that position anyway. Yeah. Any other thoughts? Yeah, right there in the black shirt.
I think it's more than just saying, that's horrible and that's
Yeah.
a shame. I think it needs to be taught and we can talk about it in high school. Like when I was in grade 10, a branded textbook, and I looked, there was one paragraph on residential schools.
Yeah.
and it's a lot to cover in one semester. We don't have time to talk about it.
Mm-hmm.
Like, so while we say, oh, we're sorry for that,
Mm-hmm.
as teachers, we're representing the board, it's representing the government, so it needs to be more than just a blank apology. It needs to be something in the classroom to discuss.
Yeah, and if you take a look at the document, the TRC document, where it has the testimony of survivors, but also their calls to action, education is named as a key place where reconciliation is imagined to occur because it can keep alive a history that has been silenced for too long, and that is too often still silenced in the name of protecting children, as though children come without trauma. Do you know what I mean? So in a sense, there's a protection of childhood innocence, which is really old, that belongs to a particular child, but not the child who ever walks through our doors, right? So the logic is very much rooted in a kind of colonial idea of protection when really they're protecting themselves, in a way. Yeah. Yeah, right there. Green, is it kind of a green shirt? Yeah.
I think that one of the most special opportunities that history provides us is that although we can't really go back in time and change it, we can learn from the mistakes of the people before us and not only target, Aboriginal issues in schools, but also use it to, make changes in any sort of oppression that's happening in education system.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, black shirt.
Yeah, I find that instead of just inheriting the past, we inherit the responsibility of constantly forging and renewing what it is to be a teacher, what it is to be responsible for the education of students. I come far away from those days of residential schools, and it's our duty to continue forging a new path, a new direction, or new hope for these students.
Yeah, I mean, it's a never-ending project. And I think the apology implies that once I say sorry, it's over. And so I think what reconciliation is really attempting to ask people to grapple with is the interminable project of reparation, which is never stopping, but always asking, what more can we do to redress, to repair? And knowing reparation can never fully end. And that's a hard thing to admit, but that might be the best we have. Yeah, one last comment. Yeah.
I remember that when I was in grade 12 high school,
Mhm.
we invited two Native Canadian chiefs to just come and tell us what it was like being in residential schools.
Yeah.
And the first thing that they said was, don't trust anything that is written in your textbook, and don't ever trust your teacher, whatever that they teach you. No,
Yeah.
they actually said that, and I myself, even though I had no part in any of the residential schools, like I can't help but take the blame somewhat, like as a Canadian. And I think that as a teacher, it is my responsibility, like not necessarily like, oh, I have to do this, but it's like I just want to take this up on myself to teach my students that yes, that not everything was all hunky. Like we've had a bit of a bad history, but let's just make sure that we don't use that as a blueprint for the future, and that we learn from it. That's my view.
Yeah, and that's a tricky thing to think about. How can I learn from history without also that becoming the blueprint, as you say, for how we imagine a future? So the idea of the future needs to also have its own openness, all the while holding on to what has been. So it's very difficult to hold those two things in tension. I think you've done that well. I have a little 2-minute video that is spoken by Justice Murray Sinclair on the question of reconciliation. Would you be interested to hear what this commissioner thinks about what reconciliation means? He invokes education as one of the first sort of places to think. I think we should go to it just for a new voice. It's just a 2-minute video, and that would be a way to conclude. We've got some time. Okay.
Hello, everybody. I'm Murray Sinclair. I'm the chair of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada. I want to talk to you for a few minutes about the issue of reconciliation, something which, of course, is very important to us here at the Commission, but also is of interest and importance to a lot of people in Canada. One of the things that we at the Commission have discovered is that it took us a long time to get to this point in terms of the relationship between Aboriginal people in this country. 7 generations of children went through the residential schools. And each of those children who were educated were told that their lives were not as good as the lives of the non-Aboriginal people of this country. They were told that their languages, their cultures were irrelevant. They were told that their people and their ancestors were heathens and pagans and uncivilized and needed to give up that way of life to come to a different way of living. At the same time that that was going on, non-Aboriginal children in the non-Aboriginal school systems of this country were also being told the same thing about Aboriginal people. So as a result, many generations of children, including you and your parents, have been raised to think about things in a different way, in the wrong way, in a way that is negative when it comes to Aboriginal people. And we need to change that. It was the educational system that has contributed to this problem in this country, and it's the educational system we believe that's going to help us to get away from this. We need to look at the way that we educate children. We need to look at the way that we educate ourselves. We need to look at what it is that our textbooks say about Aboriginal people. We need to look at what it is that Aboriginal people themselves are allowed to say within the educational system about their own histories. In addition to that, we also believe that what's important when it comes to looking at the way that children are educated is to understand that because it took us so many generations to get to this point, it's going to take us at least a few generations to be able to say that we are making progress. We cannot look for quick and easy solutions because there are none. We need to be able to look at this from the perspective of where do we want to be in 3 or 4 or 5 or 7 generations from now when we talk about the relationship between Aboriginal and non-Aboriginal people in this country. And if we can agree on what that relationship needs to look like in the future, then what we need to think about is what can we do today that will contribute to that objective. Reconciliation will be about ensuring that everything that we do today is aimed at that high standard of restoring that balance to that relationship.
I'm just going to leave that. So, what did you make of Murray Sinclair's comment? His call to education. Some of us have kind of mentioned some of what he said, which is quite lovely. Yeah.
I think that what was taught to non-Aboriginals was something that was left out of the
Yeah.
discussion before that.
Yeah.
A really huge part of it.
Yeah.
It's so easy to overlook.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So the very same things that were being told to Indigenous children and their families were being told also to non-Indigenous families.
And preventing them
Yeah.
from actually integrating because of what non-Aboriginals.
Mm-hmm. So his comments are so important because he's reminding us that as non-Native people, we also inherit a legacy that we need to unpack. Yeah, really, really good observation. Mm-hmm.
I think the thing that really resonated with me is that he said it was going to be hard work.
Yeah.
It wasn't just going to be an overnight change. And I think something like this, it does take a lot of work. And sometimes people can just be like, oh yeah, it's going to be great. We're going to do this and this. And that's not how it works in situations like that. So I think it was really beneficial that he said it was going to take a long time and a lot of work.
Yeah, I think that's a great comment as well. It's going to take a lot of work. I mean, I was just thinking as you were saying your comment that it might mean that you try to do something in your classroom on Indigenous history, and it brings up things that you didn't expect to be there, and so it's hard for you. So it won't just be that you've got willing listeners in your students, or you might encounter resistance that makes you feel uncomfortable, and what do you do with that? And so it'll complicate the job of the teacher as this person who can just lead people into knowledge, which is the very problem that residential school history documents. So yes, it would be considered hard work, and he's mentioned that, and I think your comment made me think of an example of why that might be. I find this history lecture hard to do. It's your second day to come into the teacher education program, and it's difficult knowledge to hear, and all the while still feel that you belong and can have a place in the field of education, but it will be a difficult belonging. I think that's actually a kind of hopeful position to be able to be in, is my view. Yeah, at the back.
I think it's important to note that even though we did call out the education system, he also said that the education system, he saw the education system as a means of correcting problems. So I think it's important for us to take this opportunity to redeem ourselves as educators. And to note that,
Mm-hmm.
You're saying, help
Yeah.
us to fix the problem that you created.
Yeah.
So I think it's a great responsibility for every new teacher
Mm-hmm.
to take that and do everything that you can to turn things around.
I think it's a very important time to be a teacher, given the political landscape of this history in particular. But we could add on all kinds of narratives. But I think it is a time in history where the teacher's responsibility arguably has always been there. But I think this is a particular responsibility. And I think it is something that includes all of us. Yeah. Yeah, last comment right here.
I think as well as learning about the past, all of us in this room are going to be creating, the landscape that we'll be learning about in the future.
Yeah.
So beyond us fixing what was wrong, we need to be the kinds of teachers that we want to learn about,
Uh-huh.
in the year 2015, in that time period, this is the teacher for afterwards.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, think about, and almost on the line of what Marie Sinclair was saying, the comment was to think about what kind of teacher you want to be remembered as 7 generations from now, because that's what he's suggesting is how long our future has to be, rather than quick fix solutions or what have you. And I actually think that given your status as newcomers to the field, I think you actually have the best chance to have the stance of openness that I think is required for the listening that a lot of the survivors say is required, rather than a position of expertise where I know what needs to be done in order for this to be fixed. I think that's an iteration of the problem. So I feel like if you could embrace your newness, your beginner status, your uncertainties, your self-doubts, those are the kinds of things that allow for you to welcome who's in your classroom because you don't know. You don't presume to know already. And I would actually ask you to hold on to this feeling you have right now that might be that you wish to get rid of because you want to know, what do I need to do to become a good teacher? I actually think that maybe self-doubt, uncertainty, and not knowing will be the best opportunity you have to really kind of interrupt the whole grand narrative of the teacher as the heroic, rescuer of others. I don't know that that is the one we need to hold on to anymore. So I think you've helped me think like that and about that with your comments. So I think we're good to move on to the next part of the day. Are there any other lingering comments before we move on? One last, yeah.
Just wondering if these slides would be available online too.
Yes, if you haven't already noticed, and it contributes to my level of anxiety, there's a lovely camera person right here in the front row. And what that is about is we do take seriously the online nature of the course. All of our keynote lectures are going to be the recording, the PowerPoint slides will be available on the Moodle. So you'll have a chance to look at them again. If you wanted to really think about a point and go back and focus on something, you'll have the opportunity to watch them again. But it's a great question, yeah. Thank you for your attention, and thank you for your ideas. So.